The Great Plains turn into something other than soil in winter. They became a place where the sky met the ground, where breathing froze before leaving your lips, where the wind not only brought coldness but also an ancient, patient hunger. Tonight we travel through time to the Dakota region in the late 19th century, where the scenery was so vast and so exposed that winter not only came but also devoured everything. This is not a story about a great battle or a major decision, but one about an ordinary person facing something even more cruel. I'm also very curious. Where are you now? When is it your turn? Perhaps you have already slept late into the night. Perhaps the place where you are has just seen dawn, where you find yourself in that strange time and space that neither belongs to the daytime nor to the darkness. If you light, dim the lights around you. Perhaps let the fan hum gently in the background noise. That white noise soothed the edge of my thoughts. Let's gradually step into a winter that shapes life. Engrave history on the permafrost and let people understand what survival really means. Dakota's territory stretched out in all directions. A sea of grass. In summer it urges like water, but in winter it completely transforms into something else. In a white void, distance loses its meaning. If you had stood on this land in the 1870 seconds or 1880 seconds, you might have spent an hour scanning the horizon, seeing nothing but the blurry line where the earth meets the sky. Even when the snow began to fall, that line would disappear. When you came here, you might have brought land ownership and some tools because of the promise of free and stipulated by the homestead law. The government has provided 160 acres of land for anyone willing to prove it to build, cultivate and live on for 5 years. In the land office in the east, they won't tell you unless you've experienced it yourself. What you won't know is that the winter here is different from that in Ohio, Pennsylvania, or even Illinois. The winter on the Dakota Plains is a completely different scene, an attack without any warning until it took its life. In the first autumn, your first task is to build some kind of shelter before it snows. If you have money, you might transport logs from the distant Missouri River and build a small wooden house with soil and grass. However, it's more likely that you built something called soda water, a house dug out of the ground. You need to plow thick roots on the long strip of grassland turf and then stack these heavy bricks into a 3-foot deep wall. The turf on the roof is mostly laid on poplar poles, if you can find it, or just on woven grass. When it rains, the soil will drip down in the following days. But he has a great virtue. It keeps you warm better than anything you make yourself. Those 3-foot high walls become your fortresses against the wind, which can take away the heat of the wood within minutes. In this room of approximately 14 feet by 16 feet, your entire life unfolds. You cook, eat, sleep, give birth, care for the sick, and sometimes bury the deceased. All of these are in the walls that are always filled with the smell of damp earth and smoke. The floor was covered with soil, pressed hard by footprints, but it had never been completely dry. In winter, frost climbs up from below. When you wake up, you will find that the potatoes you buried in the corner have frozen, even though you are indoors. A small window, if you are lucky enough to have real glass, allows the faint light. More often than not, you place the oiled paper on the picture frame. When the sun shines on the frame, it emits a faint light, but you can't see the outside world. At night, a lantern or a butter candle and dispel the darkness. But fuel is precious, so most of the time you sit in the dark, waiting to fall asleep. Your eyes have adapted to the eternal darkness until you almost forget what the bright light looks like. The furniture was spare. A table was made from the leftovers you dragged from the carriage. Chairs, if you were lucky, were more often just stools or upside-down crates. The bed is a frame strung together with ropes, on which a corn husk mattress is laid. Every time it is moved, it makes a rustling sound. This mattress can offer a little comfort to the cold seeping in from the floor. You hung a blanket on the ceiling to divide the space, giving people a small illusion of privacy, but sound spreads easily. In winter, when you seal every crack to block the wind, the air will be filled with the smell of corpses, food, potty pots and kerosene that stings your eyes. The children slept in 3 or 4 on one bed, huddling together to keep warm. The baby was wrapped so tightly that it could hardly move. Parents were worried that the baby would freeze stiff at night without a blanket. The stove, a small cast-iron box, if you drag it westward, or a makeshift fire box made of stones, occupies the center of everything. All the activities at home revolve around it. Of course, it's cooking and doing the laundry. This is the only place where ice can melt into water and the only heat source that can determine life and death. Feeding the stove has become your daily routine. On the grassland without trees, wood is scarce, so you learn to burn what the land offers. The twisted grass was tied up tightly and burned hot and fast. More commonly, before the cattle disappear, you burn a large amount of buffalo slices and dry manure, which is scattered on plains. You would have the children go out with sacks to collect these flat, dried discs, which burn slowly and steadily, although they fill the soda with a peculiar moldy smoke. Later, when the water buffalo disappeared, you burned beef slices, twisted hay, or even corn cobs, anything that could generate heat. However, collecting fuel requires time and effort, and the days in winter are very short. You learn to ration wolf-like food, let the fire go out at night, curl up under every quilt and blanket, breathe into the pillow, and create a small pocket of warmth on your face. The winter morning comes late, and the sun is reluctant to rise. When it does, it hangs pale in the distance, giving people light but no warmth at all. When you woke up, you found the room so cold that frost had formed even inside the walls. Beautiful crystal patterns would be lovely if they didn't represent the heat escaping from every tiny crack in your shelter. Your breath turned snow-white in the haze. The bucket froze into a solid overnight, just like every night after the deep winter time. You had to cut the ice cubes into the pot, melt them over the reignited fire, and not even have time to drink a glass of water. Getting up requires a kind of courage and mental preparation. You will lie there to tidy yourself up, knowing that once you throw the blanket back, the cold will surround you, just like falling into the river of winter. Then you would move quickly, your feet stepping on the frozen floor, gasping for breath due to its vibration, and rush towards the stove, where the embers from last night might still retain a hint of warmth. You would coax these embers with hay, gently blowing and nurturing them to reignite the flames, your hands trembling with cold and urgency. Once it catches fire, you will circle around it, allowing heat to seep into your body, and then do other things. This ritual, this slow warming, may take an hour on the coldest morning. Your winter clothes have turned into layer upon layer of armor. Inside your skin, you wear wool or cotton underwear and seldom change it, because it is almost impossible to wash and dry clothes in winter. In addition, wear some wool, a shirt, a vest and a jacket. If you are going out, sometimes you will wear 2 jackets. Your best jacket will have patches at the elbows and cuffs, and fabric that has been worn out for many years will become thinner. But you keep it all the time because wool, even worn minus out wool, is the only thing that can keep you from freezing to death. If you were lucky enough or smart enough to have bought it long ago, you would have owned a buffalo robe, a thick piece of animal skin, with the first end, the fur inside tightly attached to your body. These robes are heavy and weigh about 30 pounds, but their warmth retention is unparalleled. It is said that in a snowstorm, people would completely wrap themselves in the buffalo robes and let the snow bury them until the snowstorm passed. But by sun word disappearing from the plains, being hunted to the brink of extinction, and by the 1882, this kind of robe was becoming increasingly rare. You can only make do with what you have. A coat made of wool was oiled, although the oil smelled bad and left dark stains. Your hand hurts the most. The gloves were very thin, or there weren't any gloves at all, only rags wrapped around the fingers. Heavy work. All work is heavy and requires dexterity, so you often work with your bare hands, endure the pain of cold, endure the numbness of your fingers, and then as the blood circulation battles against temperature, you experience pain and a deep burning sensation. Frostbite can occur very easily. At first, you will feel some warning signs, such as stinging, numbness and whitening of the skin. If you notice it barely, you can heat the affected area slowly instead of quickly, as this will cause more serious damage. After recovery, there will be nothing but pain. And if you fail to catch it, or because the livestock needs care, or the roof collapses under the snow and you have no choice, but to keep working. Then the frostbite will deepen. Your fingers or toes will turn waxy white, then grey, and finally black as the tissue gets stained. Have you ever heard of people losing their fingers, toes, and sometimes even their entire feet due to frostbite? As you can see yourself, your neighbor's left hand only has one thumb and one finger left. The rest were taken away by a winter storm 5 years ago. At that time, he got lost and walked from the barn to the house, spending for hours looking for his front door in the whiteout doors. Your feet are no better either. Boots were very expensive, and most settlers wore things they brought from the east. Leather boots designed for mild climates are not suitable for walking in snow up to 3 feet deep, or in temperatures as low as -40 degrees. You would stuff your boots with straw or paper to keep them warm, but the moisture from your sweat would soak them through, and the moisture would make them cold. Less than an hour after going out, your feet will go numb. You will limp while doing housework, unable to feel whether you are walking correctly, believing in habit balance. In the evening you took off your boots and found that your stockings were frozen on your skin, which were ice crystals formed by sweat. You will warm your feet by the stove, and this feeling will make you extremely uncomfortable. The needle make you feel suffocated. Sometimes you even cry, although you cry quietly and don't want to disturb the children. The pain endured by the children is heart-wrenching. They need competitions, they need sports, and they need the energy required to burn their youth. But winter has imprisoned all of you. They gathered around the stove, bored and agitated, quarreling with each other for no reason. Try to keep them busy. Teach them to write, tell them stories, and assign them some small tasks, such as combing wool or shelling dry beans. But what children need is not just a dim room and quiet sounds. They need sunlight, fresh air, and space to run. But winter deprives them of all of these. When the weather permits, when the wind stops and the temperature rises above 0 degrees, you will send them outside for a short period of time, wrapping them up tightly until they can hardly move. When they returned, their cheeks were rosy and their hair snow-white, briefly regaining their vitality. But such days are rare. You learn not to take risks because the weather can change without warning. If a storm comes, children wandering 50 feet away from the house will get lost within minutes. The variety of food in winter is very limited. You will desperately preserve everything you can in autumn. The potatoes and radishes were buried in a pit outside, covered with straw and soil. Wrap the carrots in the sand and place them in the coolest corner of the soda. Cabbages are hanging on the roof beams. Put the dried beans and corn in gunny bags and hang them from the ceiling to prevent rats from biting them. Flowers, if you can afford them, serve as a measure of your safety. You bought as many things as possible before winter came. You carefully stored 50 to 100 bags to check for weevils, because you knew this flour would determine whether you ate the bread or not. Meat is scarce. If you kill a pig or a cow before winter comes, you will salt or smoke some of it. For apart from a cow and a few chickens, most settlers couldn't afford livestock. Chickens stop laying eggs in winter. Their bodies store energy to resist the cold. If you have a cow, its milk production will decrease. You will strongly protect it because losing it means losing your only reliable source of protein and fat. If possible, you would go hunting and struggle to catch rabbits or pheasants in the snow. But in the depth of winter, when game is scarce, it is often not worth the risk to stay outside for several hours just for a thing rabbit. More often than not, you can only make do with what you have. Salted meat, boiled beans, cornbread, and dried apple slices, if you can save some. Coffee is a luxury that most people cannot afford, so you drink substitutes, roasted grains, cherries, or just hot water if you have molasses. Children drink milk when they have it and drink water when they don't. By the end of winter, scurvy quietly enters your life. Even though you may not yet know what it is, your gums will bleed when you chew, your joints will hurt, fatigue will weigh on you like a blanket. Lack of fresh food, any green things, fruits, or vegetables will gradually deplete your body. You will see immigrants coming out of winter with loose teeth, wounds that cannot heal, and weak bodies that persist until spring. Cooking itself is a challenge. The stove is small and the fuel is hard to predict. Mix the cornmeal with water and salt, spread it on a pan, and then bake it into a hard cake and keep it for a few days. You need to cook the beans for several hours. This is precious fuel, but the beans won't soften in any other way. You will get rid of all the fat residue and store it in a jar because fat means taste and calories, both of which are urgently needed by us. Eating is necessary. Everyone eats from the pot with a spoon or their fingers. There is no ritual, it's just a basic need to fill their stomachs. The food is rarely delicious. Salt and oil are your only seasonings. But you ate it without complaint, because it was impossible not to eat. Children sometimes cry out of hunger, especially at the end of winter when supplies are scarce. You will give them the remaining bread, dilute it and make it look more, tell them stories to divert their empty attention. You often go to bed hungry yourself, telling yourself to eat the next day. If you are a husband, give it to your child or your wife. If you are a wife, give it to your husband. Everyone wants to keep it from each other. Despite the cold weather, work has never stopped. There are tasks that cannot be postponed every day. Livestock need to be fed. This cow needs milking. The ice must be dragged out of the stream or melted from the snow. It is necessary to fight an endless battle against the cold. Put on your clothes, steel yourself, push open the door and let the wind steal your breath. The air at -20 degrees has burned your lungs. Every breath is a little pain. You need to learn to wrap your face with a scarf to control it. A barn, if you have built one, or more likely just a sloping house made of hand poles, is about 30 to 40 yards away from the house. On sunny days, you can easily see it, but once winter really comes, there are very few sunny days. More often than not, you will step out of your home and into a world that has been wiped away by the blown snow. The wind blew the snow horizontally, stinging the exposed skin and filling your eyes, so you had to squint to see anything. Under such conditions, the 30-yard journey becomes very dangerous. Have you heard of such a story? And left his home to look after animals and was found frozen to death 100 yards away, lost his way and died within the sight of his home. So you took preventive measures. Many settlers tied ropes between their houses and barns, so that even if you couldn't see your feet, you could grasp and follow this lifeline. You will hold onto the rope tightly, alternating your hands and moving forward along it. The snow on your shoulders will pile up like a mountain. You won't know you have succeeded until you reach the wall of the barn. In the barn, it's not much warmer than outside. Just to shelter from the wind, your animals stand in their cold breaths. The water for the cow must be free of ice, and her feed must be carefully rationed from the haystacks, which must last until spring. You would milk her with your stiff fingers. The milk was steaming in the cold air. You would carry the bucket home, being very careful not to spill the milk, because if it spilled, it would freeze before it even hit the ground. Sometimes, the milk in the buckets on the sidewalk freezes and turns into mud, which has to be melted on a stove. If you raise chickens, they will be crowded in boxes lined with straw. You go to look for eggs, but rarely find them. Then you feed them, trying to keep them alive through the winter, because the chickens in spring also mean eggs, which means a bountiful little resurrection. Day after day, week after week, month after month, these monotonous tasks are tormenting you in ways that have nothing to do with physical exhaustion. It's all the same, unchanging, lacking any breakthroughs or changes, which will disappoint you. The days mingled into weeks, without any distinction. Sunday might mean reading a short prayer from an old Bible or, if the weather permits, gathering with neighbors at someone's home, led by someone who feels called. But winter often makes such gatherings impossible, and Sunday becomes another day of survival, no different from Saturday or Tuesday. Time has lost its mark and turned into a slowly flowing river with no reference point. This isolation deepened everything. Your nearest neighbor might be 3 meters away. This distance is easy to walk in summer, but almost impossible in winter. Apart from your immediate family members, you won't see anyone else for several weeks. The silence of the grassland in winter is only broken by the wind and the occasional cawing of crows, becoming oppressive. You feel a heavy burden in your chest. Conversations with spouses or children become tense and thin. You said everything you needed to say a few weeks ago. Now you are both living in a state of feigned death, waiting for winter to come. The argument broke out for no reason. The way someone chews, the child's whining, and the forgotten household chores. The confined space magnified all the stimuli. There was no escape, no way to walk away, no way to calm down. The tense atmosphere intensified. You have seen many families destroyed by winter, not because of death, although death does occur, but because of the gradual erosion of confinement. Because when a person can see nothing but the same four walls, the same face and the same endless white outside, madness will crawl into his mind. Some men and women just went bankrupt. You'll hear about it in spring. A woman was found talking nonsense in the snow, trying to walk back to Iowa. She believed that as long as she kept going, she would succeed. A person who had refused to speak for months sat by the stove, his eyes vacant. The children no longer played or talked. They just sat with their hands on their legs, not looking at anything. Darkness makes it even more complicated. The days in winter are very short. On the winter solstice, it may only last for 8 hours, and most of the time it is very dim. The sun is weak and distant, and its light penetrates through the clouds and falling snow. You will wake up in the dark and do the morning housework in half light and half darkness. Bye for pay. Noon. Darkness will fall again. Living under the light of lanterns, your eyes get tired and your spirit is low. But there is no other way but to sleep. Sleeping is at least an escape. You will go to bed as early as possible, sometimes right after dinner, because falling asleep is always better than waking up in the cold and darkness. But my sleep in winter is intermittent. The cold, the wind and the crying of the child woke you up. You lay awake in bed, listening to the sound of running water and moans in the house, wondering if the roof could still hold up and if the storm that was pounding against the walls would eventually find its way into the house. Fear is with you, mostly nameless and silent, but it always exists. Worried that supplies will run out, worried that someone will fall ill, worried that a big fire will destroy everything minus your house, your property, your family. Fire might be the most terrifying thing, because in winter, if your house catches fire, you have nowhere to go. You'll freeze to death before you can get help. Assuming you can even find your neighbor's way in the storm. Say you are extremely cautious with the stove and the lantern, checking them over and over again, always realizing that one mistake could end everything. However, the accident still happened. The spark to start a fire, a spark on the stove hits the hay used to start a fire. A lamp is knocked over by a tottering child. The chimney blocked by cream suddenly caught fire. Disease is another great fear. A simple cold and damp soda may turn into pneumonia. Pneumonia is fatal. Your lungs are filled with fluid, slowly drowning you, while your family watches helplessly. You will do your best to care for the patients, burn bricks at their feet, make soup with cooked bones, and wrap their chests with any cloth soaked in any folk remedy you believe in. Goose fat, rosin, camping oil, if you have any, but most of the time, you just wait and see if they can recover or die. In winter, I couldn't find a doctor and had no way to ask for help. Apart from the medicine I carried with me, I had no other medicine and couldn't use the dried grassland herbs from last summer to make medicine. Children are particularly vulnerable. A fever that might go unnoticed in summer can be fatal in winter. In spring, when the ground is done hard, you bury the small corpse because the soil in winter is as hard as iron and you can't dig a decent grave. The corpses of those who died in winter were wrapped in blankets or sewn into bed sheets and placed outside to be preserved in the cold until spring. Sometimes you put them in a shed or tilt them out of sight, but they still exist. This coldly reminds us of how thin the boundary between being alive and dying is. Death in winter has a different nature. Compared with death in the sweltering summer or during the autumn harvest, death is quieter, more inevitable and less conspicuous. People simply stopped. Their hearts failed, their lungs were filled with blood, and their bodies were exhausted from the cold, hunger and the relentless struggle for survival. You will gather the remaining family members together, pray, promise to bury them properly next spring, and then go back to continue living, because survival requires your full commitment. And sadness is a luxury that you can only afford until the end of winter. The wind is your eternal companion, the sound of winter. Its peaks in 100 different tones. A low moan passed through the gap. A high whistle that passes through a gap you can't find. The roar in the storm shook the walls. You need to learn to read the wind, knowing when it's just cold and when it indicates the arrival of bad weather. Some nature of the sound, perhaps a drop in pitch or a change in direction, will make you rush to add fuel, check the animals and prepare for the storm. When the storm comes, it redefines reality. A real Dakota blizzard is different from any you have experienced in the East and from what you could have imagined before going through it. The sky will darken, not black, but turn into a strange yellowish minus gray. The wind will rise until it becomes a physical force, pushing you and stealing your balance. Then the snow came, not falling but swirling horizontally when the wind speed reached 40, 50 or 60 meters per hour. Visibility will drop to zero within a few minutes. You can't see your hands in front of you, can't see up and down clearly. Apart from the howling of the wind and the hissing of the snow, you can hear nothing. If you are trapped outside during a storm, even if it's just in the yard, even if it's only 20 feet away from your door, you could die. The wind immediately makes you lose your way and spin around, and the cold drains your strength at a terrifying speed. People were frozen to death, leaning against their own houses, unable to find the door, their hands tightly pressing against the wall that should have saved them, on the verge of death. The children who were sent to draw water from the well went missing. A few weeks later, they were found under the snowdrift, their frozen bodies still holding empty buckets. So when the storm comes, you stay at home. Make sure there is fuel in the stove and at least enough food to last for several days, and then sit down and wait, because you have no other choice. Storms can last for several hours and sometimes for several days. Snow will accumulate on the walls, float onto the rooftops and cover the windows. Even at noon, the house will get dark and the light is blocked by the snow. You can only survive by the light and try to stay calm when the wind howls. Sometimes, no matter how hard you try, the snow still buries in. Fine powder sieved out from the crevices you couldn't see, formed small piles in the corners of the room, melted beside the stove, and turned into puddles that you had to wipe clean with a rag. When the storm finally passes and you have to dig a path, you really have to push the door open until you have cleared enough snow to open it, and then shovel out a path leading to the barn, the well and any place you need to reap. The outside world will change. Drifting 6, 8, or 10 feet high, it was carved into strange shapes by the wind, hard and smooth. Sometimes it is possible to walk on these snowdrifts. The snow is very hard, supporting your weight. Sometimes it can be very dangerous as the ground collapses beneath you, throwing you into the soft snow and swallowing you up to your waist or chest. It may take several days to dig out from a heavy snowstorm. While you are digging, you are worried about the next storm because they come in gusts. You may only have 1 or 2 days of calm before the sky darkens again. The weight of the snow on the turf roof has always been a problem. The turf is heavy from the very beginning. If the storm is strong enough, the snow will increase the weight of the turf to several tons. You'll climb up, which is risky in itself, and then try to shovel off some of them. But it's a very tiring job and you can't possibly shovel them all off. Some roofs collapsed, burying family members inside. You will hear such news in spring in a storm in February when their soda collapsed. The entire family suffocated or broke down. The neighbors didn't discover the body until the snow melted in April. Your own roof creaks under heavy pressure. You lie in bed listening to these sounds, not knowing if it will collapse tonight. If it does, where can you go? But in most cases, it holds true. In most cases, you have weathered another storm, a week or a month. This is the basic fact about settling down in Dakota during the winter. Survival is not a victory, nor is it a victory worth celebrating. It is merely a fact that must be repeated day after day until spring finally arrives and sets you free. In January or February, spring seems out of reach, as if it were another vague dream in life. You try to recall what warmth feels like, what the grass looks like, and the stinging smell of the soil, but you just can't remember. Winter erased those memories, replacing them with coldness, white and endless wind. You endured it because you had no choice. Somewhere in exhaustion, fear and hunger lies hope, hoping that this land, once winter is over, will offer you something better, a bountiful harvest, a future, and a life worthy of all suffering. But now only the next day, The next stall and the next small task can keep you alive. You feed the stove, you turn snow into water, you ration the beans and flour. Just wait. The rhythm of your days has turned into that of winter, slow, repetitive, heavy silence and indifference. You've been spending these days like a sleepwalker, conserving your energy, talking less and doing what you should do. That's all. Time is strangely stretched and compressed. A morning may last forever, and a week may pass by imperceptibly. Uniformity makes it hard to remember. Have you mended the hole in your coat yet? Or did you fix it last week? When was the last time you saw your neighbor? Was it a month ago or 2 months ago? You mark the passage of time with the height of the flowers in the bucket, the reduction of fuel, and the arc of the rising sun, even though winter is still going on. These are your calendars, more reliable than memory and more honest than hope. It began peacefully on the northern plain in January 1888. Cold but not unbearable, the kind of cold that immigrants have learned to endure. The first few weeks of this month passed unscathed, with each day repeating the previous one. The morning chores were crammed together by the stove, and the darkness of dawn enveloped the grassland. Then came Thursday, January 12th, when the weather was unexpectedly mild. Overnight, the temperature rose to over 20 degrees Fahrenheit, so warm that the ice on the bucket thinned, so warm that once the wind gently blew on your face. This is a false spring, sometimes emerging on the mid-minor season plains, with a brief respite that lift you up and make you believe that the worst might have passed for several hours. The children were awakened by this extraordinary warmth, and requested to take off their thick coats and go outside to school. The parents, relieved by the arrival of the cold, agreed. Classes start at 9 o'clock. The 1-room school buildings are scattered all over the place. The buildings serve both as classrooms and community centers. That Thursday morning, the children walked to school along familiar paths from the farm within a radius of 2 to 3 miles, about 3 kilometers. Some alone and some with their siblings or neighbors. The snow beneath my feet became soft in the gentle air, which made it the most difficult for me to walk in several weeks. The sky was overcast with dark clouds, pale and thin. Although the sun was weak, its rays on the raised face almost made one feel warm. The teachers are usually young women from the eastern United States, not much older than their eldest students. They come to school early and light fires in the school stoves. They tidied up the stone slabs and introductory reading materials, mentally preparing for the day's lessons, such as reading, arithmetic, and if the older children were attentive, they might also learn some geographical knowledge. These teachers live far from home and stay with local families at a rate of a few dollars per month. They teach because teaching is one of the few decent occupations that unmarried women can engage in. They are not only responsible for education, but also for the safety and happiness of every child who walks into their homes. Around 10 a.m., most schools in parts of Dakota, Nebraska and Minnesota, as usual, praise the students, who could be 15 or 30 years old and ranged in age from 5 to 16. The children were sitting on the benches, the youngest in front and the oldest at the back, all facing the teacher's desk and the blackboard at the back. The class that morning went smoothly. Young children practiced letters and read out the words in the McGolf reading book. Older students do arithmetic problems, drawing numbers on the blackboard with creaking chalk, leaving dust on their fingers. The stove ticked to a halt, burning less fuel than usual because the weather was mild. Some teachers even allow cracks in the windows to let fresh air in the rooms that have been closed for several months. For around noon, the children had dinner, perhaps cold cornbread or cookies spread with a little jam, no matter what their mother had prepared in the morning. Some children ate very quickly and asked for permission to run and play in a relatively warm place outside. The teachers agreed and were glad to see the children relieved from the imposed confinement in winter. But while the children were eating and playing, in the far northwest, something was moving. An unimaginably cold Arctic air broke free from the frozen north and swept southward across the Canadian plains at an extremely fast speed. This air comes from regions where winter never ends, where the temperature often drops to -50 or 60 degrees Celsius. The atmosphere there seems to be detrimental to life, and it falls on the Great Plains at an unpredictable speed. The weather forecast in 1888 was at best primitive. As the predecessor of the Meteorological Bureau, the Signal Service maintained some scattered stations, which collected temperature and air pressure data, but the communication speed was very slow, and the science of weather prediction was still in its infancy. Meteorologists in Washington have noticed the cold front and even issued warnings, but it took several hours for these warnings to be transmitted by telegram, and they reached towns rather than isolated schools on the prairie. Most settlers and teachers received no warning at all. At around 1 p.m., I happened to take a look at the teacher outside and began to notice a change. The sky in the north darkened rapidly. It was not the approaching dusk gradually darkening, but a sudden, ominous change. The temperature, which had been warm throughout the morning, began to drop. Even through the wall, you could feel a sudden chill, as if someone had opened it or leading to the frozen room. Some teachers sensed danger and immediately called the children back into their rooms. Others were hesitant, unsure whether to end school earlier and send their children home while travel was still possible, or to keep them at school, as they would be safe if the situation worsened. Decisions must be made quickly. Different teachers made different choices, and these choices determined who survived and who died in the following hours. The storm came at an astonishing speed. In some places, the temperature dropped by 50 degrees within 3 minutes, almost instantly from over 20 degrees below zero to 30 degrees below zero. The wind rose from zero to a howling gale in an instant, from calm to 60 miles per hour before you could breathe. The snow was blown hither and thither by the wind, thick and blind, turning the day into a white chaos. The teacher who had originally confined the students indoors suddenly found himself trapped in the school's houses, which creaked and groaned under the attack. The window was originally open, but now a bone-minus chilling wind was seeping in. The teachers were busy cleansing the window, stuffing rags into the crack and adding fuel to the stove. The children, who had been restless and bored just now, were now huddled together, frightened by the sudden howling wind, the shaking of the walls and the darkness that had descended before afternoon. Some people cried, and the teachers tried their best to calm them down and show confidence, even though their own hearts were beating in fear. In a school near Dakota in Dakota Territory, a teacher named Minnie Freeman, despite feeling scared, still decided to keep her students inside. The house was small and simple. As the storm intensified, she could see the sunlight she had never noticed before through the cracks in the wall. The stove was roaring in the wind and burning fuel very fast, running out of fuel within a few hours. Minnie gathered 16 children aged 6 to 14, told them stories and sang with them, as long as they wouldn't think about the storm. But this building cannot withstand the wind. At around 2 o'clock, a particularly fierce gust of wind blew off part of the roof, and snow began to pour into the school building. Within seconds, the wind absorbed the heat from the rooms. Minnie made a decision that was later called heroic, although it seemed necessary at that time. She would take the children to the nearest house, which she believed might be a quarter of a mile away. She couldn't let them freeze in the house without a roof. She asked the children to hold hands and she formed a chain in front, and then they walked into the snowstorm. Cold is like a blow to the body, stealing the breath and burning the bare skin. Visibility is absolute zero. Minnie couldn't see the child in the hand she was holding, except that it was getting whiter and whiter. She could see nothing. She can only move forward in the direction she hopes is right. Thrilling the children behind her, she prayed that she wouldn't get lost. They walked or tried to walk, but the wind blew them to one side. The snow was deep enough and every step was difficult. The children ripped and fell down. Minnie had to stop and pull them up to make sure no one let go of the chain, because letting go of the chain meant disappearing into the void and never to be found. Minnie didn't know how long they had been away. Time loses its meaning in the storm. A few minutes felt like several hours. She began to worry that she had gone in the wrong direction. She was leading them to the vast grassland towards death, but somehow they miraculously came to a house. Minnie touched the wall. Before she could see it, the wall was solid and real in the dazzling snow. She found the door and pushed it open. All 16 children were lying inside, shivering with cold but still alive. Not all teachers are so lucky. Elsewhere, Teachers trying to get their children home from school helplessly watched the students disappear in the storm, just a few steps away from the school gate. Near O'Neill, Nebraska, a teacher named Louise Royce also faced a terrifying choice when the storm hit. She had 17 students, and she knew that letting them spend the night in the school building would surely mean death. It was too cold in the house. The wind was too strong and they had almost no fuel. She decided to look for the nearest house, about 80 poles away, less than a quarter of a mile. Louise tied the children together with a rope and led them into the stall. But in a snowstorm, 80 strokes is equivalent to 80 meters. A few minutes later, Louise lost her way, couldn't see anything and couldn't tell whether she was gone in circles or in a straight line. The children behind her were struggling against the wind. Some were crying, while others were silent out of fear and the cold. They wandered around for several hours. How many? Later, no one could be sure. The younger children could no longer walk. Their thin bodies were already exhausted. Lois had no choice but to hold them and pass them from her arms to the older children. Each of them took turns carrying the weight as those too young to walk. Finally, they found a refuge. It wasn't the house Louise was aiming for, but a dry hideout. They dug a haystack there, pulled dry grass around it, and built something like a nest. They huddled together all night long, sharing body temperature, almost unconscious, lingering on the verge of survival. When rescue workers found them the next day, Louise Royce had already lost both her feet due to frostbite. Several children were also frostbitten. One of them, a 7-year-old boy, died at night. Despite being squeezed together by his siblings, his body was stiff and cold. The other teachers decided to keep their students at school. Some of the teachers managed to keep everyone alive through wit and luck. When the fuel runs out, they burn furniture, tables, benches, and anything that can burn. They get the children moving, take them to do exercises, sing and do anything that can keep the blood circulating and boost their spirits. They shared the food brought by everyone, distributing biscuits, apples and hard candies, and had to eat every bite. In a school, the teacher asked the children to take turns running beside the stove. They first exercised for 5 minutes and then curled up in their coats for another 5 minutes. In another classroom, the teacher led the children in singing endless hymns. The children's voices were weak, but they persisted in the howling of the fierce wind. But not all stories end in survival. In a school near Plainview, Nebraska, a young teacher named E.T.A. tried to ensure the safety of the students, but couldn't keep enough calories. The storm raged throughout the afternoon and lasted until evening. Despite the fire, the temperature in the school building was steadily dropping. The children began to show severe hypothermia, mental confusion, drowsiness and slurred speech. BTA did her best. She wrapped the children in her own coat and then put the quilt on the wall. She held them in her arms, rubbing their hands and feet, trying to maintain blood circulation. But this is not enough. That night, 2 of her students froze to death at school, while ETI wept and prayed, constantly trying to save the others. When the rescue workers arrived the next morning, they found her still alive, struggling to hold the frozen bodies of the children she couldn't save. The storm knows no distinction between school buildings and families. When the snowstorm hit, settlers trapped outdoors had only a few minutes to find shelter, and then the cold overwhelmed them. In a homestead in Dakota, a farmer named John Kaufman was inspecting his livestock when a storm came. He tried to get back home, but the wind made him lose his way. He walked in circles and couldn't find the building 50 yards away. His wife looked out of the window. Through a small gap in the snow, she could occasionally see him, a dark figure staggering in the white. But she couldn't approach him, nor could she let him hear her call. She watched helplessly as her husband died not far from home, as he eventually collapsed and vanished into the snow. Yet there was nothing she could do. Another man trapped between the barn and the house killed one of his cows with a knife, removed its innards, crawled into the corpse and survived. The body temperature of this cow gradually dropped, but it still existed. The protection of the animal's skin enabled it to survive the night, although it lost several toes and part of one hand due to frostbite. Children are particularly vulnerable. In a family, 2 brothers, aged 8 and 10, were sent to a stream 200 yards away from home to fetch water. When the storm hit, they tried to return, but got lost immediately. The elder brother knew they couldn't find their way, so he made a decision which might have saved his younger brother's life. He asked the little boy to lie down, his body slightly sunken, and covered him with his own body. He stayed there, using himself as a shield against the wind. A few hours later, when their father found them, the elder brother was already dead, freezing cold, but the younger brother beneath him was still alive. Although his body temperature was too low, he survived because of his elder brother's sacrifice. The father with his 2 children, the living and the dead, crossed the heavy snow, trying to steal them all. This snowstorm raged in some areas throughout the night and lasted until the next day, bringing more snowfall and maintaining a bone-minus chilling cold. When it finally cast, the death toll was astonishing, although the exact number was hard to determine. The officially recorded death toll eventually exceeded 200, but many people believe the true figure is even higher. Those immigrants who lived alone were frozen in their homes or barns until they were discovered in spring. The children wandered around the schoolhouse and disappeared under the snow, which didn't melt until April. This storm was called the Children's Blizzard or School Building Blizzard, because many of the victims were very young and were wrapped in schools when nature changed without warning. The entire community lost its children, and the sorrow that enveloped the plain was as deep and cold as the snow itself. In many cases, funerals have to wait until spring because the ground is too cold for burial. The bodies are placed in sheds or barns until the soil is dug through. A few months later, the funeral was finally held. Grief flared up again as the small coffin was buried underground and the wound was exposed once more. She finally accepted them with a soft heart. This storm changed the settlers' view of winter. Before January 12, 1888, they were aware of the dangers of winter, but they did not fully understand its speed and its sudden power. After the snowstorm, they became more cautious. The route system between buildings has become a standard, not only recommended but also indispensable. Parents no longer send their children to school on any problematic weather, leaving them at home, even if it means losing education. The school itself has also changed its procedures. Teachers were told that if there was any weather threat, they should keep students indoors, maintain food and fuel supplies for several days, and never try to take children home during a storm, no matter how close the home is. The signal service was criticized for failing to provide sufficient warnings, despite the fact that the storm moved to fast and communication technology was too limited. The alarm could not be of much use. Despite this, the disaster has driven improvements in weather forecasting and communication, which will eventually save lives in future storms. For families that have lost their children, no improvement can reverse what has already happened. They continue to live in their own houses and work on their own land, enduring the subsequent winter, but the losses left a permanent mark on them. When the snowflakes start to fall, you will see this expression on a mother's face. Her eyes are tense and one hand unconsciously reaches for the child who is no longer by her side. You will hear from the silence of the fathers who were searching in the blizzard and found their children frozen stiff, bearing this burden for the rest of their lives. That snowstorm became the dividing line before and after in my memory. Before the snowstorm, the immigrants believed that caution and hard work could protect them. When they realized that nature on the plain would not negotiate and would not respect efforts and virtues, it just took away what it wanted. The story of the snowstorm has been told over and over again. Everyone is telling stories, polishing them to the point of being almost mythical. That behind the myth lies the original truth. That winter in Dakota might take your life and make you disappear from the world, while your loved ones are helplessly watching you outside the window. Minnie Freeman, the teacher who saved 16 students, once became famous. Newspapers all over the country reported on her bravery, and even some people wrote songs to praise her heroism. But Minnie herself never pursued fame and never believed that she had done anything remarkable. She merely did what seemed necessary at the time, and the truth was that it worked. All her students survived. In her view, it was more of luck than virtue. Many years later, when asked about that day, she would only say that she had always been very scared, convinced that she was leading the children to death. With every step she took, she was praying and asking for help to find her way. Help came. Maybe it was just by chance. Anyway, She was very grateful. The other teachers in my memory were not so lucky. Those who lost their students, even if their choices were reasonable at that time and even if no one could have predicted the ferocity of the storm, carried a sense of guilt that had never completely subsided. Despite her best efforts, she still lost students. After that winter, she left her teaching position. She couldn't bear standing in front of the classroom again, couldn't bear looking at the children but not seeing the faces of those who had died while she was holding them. This snowstorm also revealed the randomness of survival. Death may strike one family for no reason, while another survives. Two schools 1 mile apart may produce completely different results. In one school, all the students survive, while in the other, half of the children die. There is no satisfactory explanation for this difference. This is the essence of a snowstorm, capricious and unrestrained. It can either forgive the rash or punish the cautious. This randomness is more disturbing than direct danger, as it indicates that when nature decides to strike, all their meticulous preparations, rules and preventive measures may be in vain. In the weeks following the snowstorm, as survivors recovered and communities buried the dead, a collective trauma enveloped the plains. People act more carefully, speak more quietly, and look up at the sky more often. Winter went on as usual, but something changed. To some extent, these settlers were put to the test, exposing their vulnerability and resilience. They changed from their experiences and became more aware of how unstable their control over this land was. The children who survived the snowstorm also had their own scars on their bodies. Some were visible, having lost their fingers or toes, some had their skin turned white from frostbite, and some were invisible. Many people have never fully recovered from the terror of that day. The white chaos and cold memories, along with their fear that they might never see their families again. Some people refuse to return to school for weeks or months, and their parents do not force them because they know the trauma is deep. The others came back but sat by the door, peering through the window at the weather, ready to run away at the first sign of a change in the sky. Teachers have also changed. Young women who come to the West in search of adventure and decent income find themselves shouldering responsibilities they have never imagined. The lives of children depend on their judgment in times of crisis, and they must make life minus death decisions immediately. Some people left their teaching positions and returned to the East, where winters are relatively warm and schools are close. Too many refugees. Others stayed, but their teaching methods were different. Always be aware of the possible storm. Always be ready for supplies and always keep an eye on the northern sky. The blizzard entered the myth of the plain, joining in other stories of survival and disaster that defined the region. The older generation would take it as a yardstick. Compared with the snowstorm in the school, this is nothing. This became a warning and a lesson. A story told by parents to their children to explain why they couldn't walk to school when the weather was bad. Why are ropes used between buildings? Why do you never ignore the signs that a storm is coming? The deceased child became a teacher in a certain sense. Their deaths enabled future generations to understand the essence of winter in Dakota. However, apart from lessons and stories, and even from changes in behavior and procedures, the 1888 snowstorm left something else. A profound and peaceful understanding is that life on the plain is held together by the finest threads, and winter is always waiting to cut these threads. This land itself seems to carry memories. Years later, people claimed that they could feel the difference in the air on January 12th, which was the echo of that terrifying day. Whether this is real or imagined, no one knows. Long after the snow has melted, the graves have been dug and filled. What truly exists is that people know that the winter in Dakota requires not only respect, but also a kind of vigilant humility. You can do the right thing, make the right decision, maintain your home, keep your family close, but still lose everything. This knowledge shaped the characters of those who remained, making them quieter, more cautious, and less willing to boast about their conquests or achievements. They learned what could be taken away, and this lesson accompanied them through every winter that followed. A cold force silently runs through every season of snow. Long before settlers came here with their thatched houses and single-room schoolhouses, others had been living on these plains, facing the same winters. The Lakota, Dakota and Nakota people, collectively known as the Sioux people, have lived on this land for generations, moving with the change of seasons, observing the sky and the behavior of animals, and surviving through the knowledge passed down over the centuries. They left records of winter, but not in the way that European colonists believed they would keep records. These were not written records bound in magazines, but pictographic calendars drawn on buffalo hide, elk hide, or later on cloth and paper. The file known as the winter count. Winter counting is a living history, usually maintained by one person in a group, who plays the role of a keeper. Every winter, there is a photo representing the most memorable or significant event of that year. From any objective standard, it may not be the most important, but it is a prominent event that can help future generations remember that special winter and distinguish it from all other winters. These images are small, simple, and highly symbolic. One winter, there are many stars in the sky. There might be a figure surrounded by stars. If a horse is stolen in winter, there may be marks left on its body. A winter with heavy snowfall, extreme cold, and many people freezing to death. These images of people lying down, tents covered in heavy snow, and painted figures without showing specific details appear in the count during winter. The exact meaning of each symbol is preserved in the memory of the custodian and passed on orally to the person who ultimately takes on the role of maintaining the count. These winter dates can sometimes be traced back 200 years, forming a timeline that winds through centuries of life on the plain. They recorded epidemics, wars, extensive hunting, years of hunger and harsh winters, all of which became part of the tribal memory. Long after those who experienced these events passed away, they are still quoted and remembered. Such a winter has appeared in many examples. That winter, the snow was so thick and the cold was so bone-chilling that even those large, cold-resistant animals that were very adapted to the plain winter-water buffaloes died in large numbers. People who relied on water buffaloes for food, shelter, clothes, and tools were facing hunger. The symbol of this winter varies in different counts, but the memory is consistent. This winter tests people's survival skills and requires them to master all the knowledge. Some people marked it with a water buffalo lying on its side, while others marked it with tents surrounded by snow. Some people still bent over against the wind. The exact year of this winter is controversial among scholars studying calendars, as calendars are not entirely related to the European calendar system. Different gatekeepers sometimes choose different events to mark the same year, or mark the same event in different years, depending on when they think the new year begins in the seasonal cycle. But winter itself, its harshness, and its position in collective memory are beyond doubt. It did happen, and it is very important. Many communities have passed down the memory from generation to generation. The meaning of winter cannot be told to you. What they cannot tell you is that their compressed memories have been distilled into symbols, which is the feeling at experiencing such a winter. For this, you must imagine inferences drawn from the no traditional plain life and fill in the blanks between the hieroglyphics. Imagine a winter camp built in a river valley where poplar trees can shield from the wind, and even in extremely cold weather, prey can be found. The tents were arranged in a circle, with each door facing east to welcome the sunrise, so that even on the darkest days, the first ray of sunlight could shine in. These tents are not romantic images in paintings and photos, but practical and efficient workplaces. The structure is simple. The poles are arranged in a conical shape and sewn together with cowhide on top. The bottom edge is reinforced with stones to prevent wind from blowing in from below. This simplicity is deceptive, as building and maintaining a good dome tent requires a great deal of knowledge. The poles must be cut from specific trees and trimmed to the exact length and thickness. Animal skins must be properly tanned. If they are too hard, they will crack when exposed to cold. If it's too soft, it will defold. The way leather is sewn is very important. The type of tendons used, the size and spacing of the needles. The well-made and well-maintained conical tent can withstand strong winds that tear apart settlers' homes, keep a family warm in temperatures far below zero, and be dismantled and moved in less than an hour when needed. In winter, inside the dome tent, the ground is covered with layer upon layer of buffalo robes and hay, isolated from the permafrost below. The fire was burning in a pit in the center. Smoke rises from the opening at the top, where the two poles converge. This opening can be adjusted by moving to flaps that extend above the conical tent-like ears. Use poles to move them according to the wind direction, generating an airflow that pulls up and expels smoke while preventing cold air from descending. This is a chimney without a fixed structure. Elegant simplicity and effectiveness. The fire itself is small, not the roaring flame you might imagine, but a carefully maintained low flame that generates the greatest heat with the least fuel. Even before the arrival of immigrants, wood was scarce on the plains, and winter made it difficult to collect wood. Therefore, fuel is precious and must be used with caution to keep the fire burning like embers throughout the night, so that it can be reignited the next morning. People who live in this way have a completely different understanding of the cold from immigrants. Don't deal with it as an enemy, but as a condition to adapt to and cooperate with, and survive through knowledge rather than resistance. They didn't try to make their residence as warm as in summer. This will require a large amount of fuel, but it will keep them warm enough to feel comfortable in less warm conditions, and make their clothes so efficient that they can move and work at a temperature where an unprepared person would die within an hour. Their winter clothes themselves are a kind of materialized knowledge. The water buffalo robe worn inside, with the skin facing outward, creates a dead air space between the fur and the skin to maintain body heat. Leather leggings, sometimes lined with rabbit fur, are fastened tightly to prevent snow from getting in. The deer leather shoes with thick buffalo soles extend above the ankles and are stuffed with dry grass. They can be changed when soaked with sweat. Mittens are not gloves because putting fingers together can keep them warm, and mittens themselves are made from the fur of winter animals. Beavers, wolves, and buffaloes, these cold-minus adapted creatures, can be learned from by humans who are smart enough to take and use their skins. However, no matter how well clothes and accommodation are designed, they cannot solve the fundamental problems of winter. Food has become scarce. To find food, you have to go to the cold outdoors, burn off your energy, and then you must replenish your energy with the food, either found or stored. The traditional plain winter diet is rich in fat and protein, as these are what the body needs to generate heat. BMKN is a kind of dried beef mixed with fattened berries and pounded together. It is a winter staple food, rich in calories, can be stored for several months, is very light in weight, and can be carried around if the campsite needs to be moved. Beef jerky, smoked meat, dried berries, roots and stems collected in autumn, store carefully. These are the foods people have for the winter. If possible, they will also be supplemented with fresh game, deer, rabbits, and sometimes buffaloes if the hunt is successful. Although hunting buffaloes in the depth of winter is both dangerous and difficult, it requires coordination and skill, and sometimes even luck. Hunger is very likely to occur in the harsh winter, especially if the autumn hunting is bad or the winter lasts longer than expected. Winter records these times. The images of winter represent hunger, pain, and starvation. People formulated strategies for survival during barren times, carefully rationing to ensure that children and the elderly ate first. Sometimes they decided to move camps to find better hunting spots, although moving in winter was risky. Sometimes a strategy is simply patience. Try to eat less and sleep more to conserve energy, and wait for the weather to improve or spring to come. There is a kind of knowledge about winter that cannot be written down. It exists in the body and in practice. How to predict the upcoming weather. The behavior of animals tells you the temperature and the wind. How to navigate in a vast expanse of white by taking advantage of the direction of the wind and the pattern of snowdrifts. This knowledge is imparted to children from the time they can understand, not through formal courses but through observation and experience. You learn about the weather by watching your elders look at the sky every morning. By listening to them discuss what they saw, I was finally asked, "What did you see? What do you think will happen?" You learn to navigate under increasingly difficult conditions, always staying with those who know the way until you have your own sense of direction and the ability to find your way on your own, even if landmarks disappear in the snow. You learn in practice, and when you make mistakes, someone will correct you by gradually taking on more responsibilities, until one day you realize that you have the knowledge that can keep you alive. The stories told around the winter bonfire are also a form of knowledge transmission, although they seem like entertainment. The story of those who got lost in the storm and found their way home. The story of a winter so cold that the Missouri River is so frozen that one can walk across it. Stories about people who survive because of their intelligence, or die because of their stupidity. All of these are included in the narrative. There is a story about a person who ignored the signs of approaching weather and died in a storm. This is both a memorial and a warning. There is a story about someone reading the behavior of birds and finding a shelter in time. This is a lesson from observation. The story did not end with a clear moral conclusion. This is why you must keep staring at the sky all the time, because everyone who hears this story understands the truth behind it. Some winters have witnessed phenomena that seem to go beyond normal experiences. Events that enter winter are significant and remain in people's memories because they are strange, unexplainable, and different from the usual pattern of suffering in winter. Such winters occur in several places. This winter, the lights danced in the sky night after night. The colorful curtains in green, red and purple rippled like water, like something no one had ever seen before. We now know that these are manifestations of the northern lights, which are more common in the northern latitudes, but can also be seen on the plains where solar activity is intense. That for those who have never seen them, for those who have no framework for understanding the electromagnetic interaction between the solar wind and the Earth's atmosphere, these lights must seem like messages or omens, just as the sky itself is trying to convey something important and incomprehensible. Winter counting uses sky graphics and light pattern images to mark this winter. Different keepers choose different ways to represent some things that may not be fully expressed at all. What does it mean to look at the sky night after night with colors that had no origin on Earth? What's it like to stand in the cold? Before reaching the ground, your breathing froze, and above your head, incredible lights were dancing. Some winter sounds are as strange as the scenes. Ice on the river rumbles, making sounds like gunshots or thunder, which reverberate for miles across the frozen land. These sounds indicate the expansion and contraction of ice when the temperature fluctuates sharply. However, listening to their voices without understanding their reasons is equivalent to listening to the earth itself groaning, worrying, and being angry. Perhaps the count of winters sometimes marks these strange winters. In this era, nature seems to be speaking in a language that no one can fully understand. They became part of the historical record not because they changed anything. The aurora did not stop hunger, nor did it alleviate the cold. Instead, it was because they were unforgettable, because they marked that winter differently from others. There are gaps in the winter statistics, and the records stop or become unclear. Sometimes this happens because the keeper has died and no one immediately takes over the role, or because the skins themselves have been lost or damaged. Sometimes it is because the community has suffered from too many diseases, wars, and cold winters that they have scattered people, making it impossible or irrelevant to maintain the count. These blanks themselves are a kind of record, a witness to the destruction and loss of winter, or devastating events that disrupt the continuity of memory. Archaeologists and anthropologists, studying winter counts, attempt to match them with known historical events, using European records to determine the dates of hieroglyphic calendars and vice versa. Sometimes it is effective. Events recorded in winter counts and trading logs or military reports can anchor dates, giving you the confidence to trace back to the past and the future. However, there are usually ambiguities and multiple possible explanations. Scholars are divided on what a specific image represents or exactly when it occurred. The count of winter has never been deciphered by outsiders. For those who already know these stories, they are memory IDs. These people can recall the complex stories that were repeatedly told by the winter bonfire just by looking at a simple image. Without the oral traditions that accompany them, winter counts become incomplete and fragmented, just like finding the pages of a book without knowing what happened before or after. We can see that some important things are worth recording, but its full significance, the weight of emotion, and the lessons learned from it remain out of reach. However, even if incomplete, winter statistics still offer something valuable, different views on time and history. This is a way to commemorate years, not through political events or the rule of leaders, but through what happened to ordinary people, what they experienced and what they remember. For daily life, a snowy winter is more important than a distant wall. Even if no other notable events occur, a year with an abundant number of bison is still worth recording. This way of thinking that regards history as a living experience rather than a series of major events will change your understanding of the past. It will make you think about the details of daily life, which are usually not written into history books. For coldness that has never left your bones, hunger always exists at the end of winter. When spring finally arrives and you know you've lived another year, you breathe a sigh of relief. Some winter counts include images that modern scholars cannot clearly explain. During the tremendous changes that swept across the entire plain in the 19th century, the significance of these symbols was lost with the death of the gods and the destruction of oral traditions. These mysterious images are alluring. Do they mark mental events, unusual natural phenomena, the personal experiences of the keepers, or something completely different? A winter count includes an image of a figure that seems to be floating or flying, possibly surrounded by stars or smoke. Some scholars explain that this marks the death of someone in winter, and their passing is particularly significant. Others think it might represent a visual or spiritual experience, or it might reappear the aurora in a different style. The fact is that we don't know. Without the explanation of the oral tradition, perhaps we will never know. This image remains mysterious and beautiful. It reminds us that history always contains things that we cannot retrieve. The past can be approached, but we can never fully understand it. These conical tents left almost no trace after being abandoned. For though thatched cottages or cabins make a lapse, they can be seen for decades, while the ruins of conical tents are almost invisible after a few years. Perhaps it's a circle of stones waiting to be covered by animal skins. Perhaps it's the charcoal in the central fire pit. If the camp only existed briefly, perhaps there would be nothing. When archaeologists are seeking evidence of traditional plain life before the large minor-scale settlement of Europeans, they must make use of some subtle clues. The pattern of soil composition, the scattering of broken tools of pottery, and the concentration of animal bones at the slaughter site. The transience of the traditional way of life means that most of it has vanished, leaving only traces that require the eyes of experts to identify and explain. But occasionally, there are also more substantive things. Sometimes on the banks cut by rivers or on eroded slopes, a cache pool, a pit where items were buried for safety, is found and never retrieved. These storages may contain tools, clothing, and sometimes even food that has been preserved in a cold and dry environment. In the 1972, a storage site like this was discovered in South Dakota, where several pairs of winter motifs were found. After about 100 years underground, they were still well miners preserved. These deer leather shoes demonstrate the fineness of their workmanship. With multiple layers and meticulous splicing, the insulation within the turf still exists. The entire set demonstrates the skills and knowledge required to make shoes that can help you get through the winter in Dakota. Looking at these deer leather shoes displayed in the museum showcase cases, you can almost feel that their original design intention was to keep worn. One can imagine the hands that made them, most likely a woman's hands, working in the firelight on a winter night, using the knowledge passed down from generation to generation to create something both practical and beautiful. The headdress on the top of the deer shoes, featuring small geometric patterns in red, blue and white, has no practical use, but adds something important. It reminds us that survival requires more than just functionality. Even in the face of deadly cold, beauty and pride are very important. Other collections are not as romantic, but they are equally important. Stone tools for scraping animal skins, stone tools for drilling holes in leather, bone needles for sewing, and basic equipment needed for making clothes and living quarters. These objects themselves are very ordinary, but they represent thousands of hours of knowledge. Know which stone is the best scraper, how to shape and sharpen it, and the angle and pressure required to scrape the animal skin clean without damaging it. Every item created by traditional methods requires knowledge, and each piece of knowledge represents the attempts and mistakes of several generations, learning what works and what doesn't, and passing on successful techniques through teaching and demonstration. Burn needles seem very simple until you try to do them. It is not until you realize that you need to know which bone to use, how to shape them without breaking, and how to drill holes and thread in materials as hard as stone. Buffaloes themselves, before they were almost extinct, had a kind of knowledge in their behavior. They migrate with the seasons, moving northward in summer and southward in winter. But in this overall model, they respond to local conditions and the way people observe and learn. If water buffaloes leave an area earlier than usual in autumn, it may mean that a harsh winter is approaching. If they gather in certain valleys, it indicates that there are better shelters or feeds in these places. Hunters who pay attention to the behavior of bison have learned to predict the weather and use the bison's instinctive knowledge of the land to find the best wintering spots. When bison herds are destroyed, millions of bison are killed to obtain skins for entertainment, which is a deliberate strategy to disrupt the traditional plain lifestyle. His source of knowledge also vanished as a result. People have not only lost the main sources of food and materials, but also the behavioral libraries that guide their own actions and decisions. A few surviving water buffaloes live in groups in deliberately protected areas, and their behaviors have also changed. They are confined to a smaller area, no longer migrate long distances, and are no longer fed by humans when necessary. They have transformed into different creatures and no longer exhibit all the natural behaviors that once provided information and guidance. This is a special kind of loss. The loss of knowledge does not exist in human memory, but in the behavior of animals, in their movement patterns when crossing terrains. When the last true bison vanished, they took away an understanding that could not be reconstructed from written records or archaeological evidence, because it had never been written down or made into object. It only exists in observation, in the relationship between humans and animals who share the land. The counts of winter continued until the early 20th century, although their nature changed along with the changes in people's lives. Subsequent counts marked the transition to a reserved life and the loss of the traditional way of life. Living government miners provided housing in winter instead of in tents. Food was rationed, not hunted. In the following winters, these images revealed the tension between the old and the new, a conical tent next to a square house, the mixture and conflict of the ways of existence of traditional and Western clothing. These counts document cultural changes, adaptations and losses, as well as people's efforts to maintain their identities and memories in an environment that requires transformation. Some breeders stopped counting, believing that the new lives did not conform to the old pattern of recording memorable events, or perhaps they felt that the current events were too painful and that too many lost records were not worth keeping. Other maintainers continue to seek ways, recording even the most difficult changes, and maintaining tradition, even if the world it recorded vanishes. The last traditional winter count is believed to have existed until the 1920s, when most breeders had died and the younger generation was educated in Western schools to record time and history in the European way, using dates and written narratives rather than pictographic calendars. The surviving counts were collected by anthropologists, historians and museums. They are preserved there as artifacts, beautiful and mysterious, serving as part of the window to understanding time and experience. Fundamentally different from the dominant culture that ultimately overwhelmed them, you can now see them behind the glass. The images have faded, but they are still clearly visible on leather or fabric. Each tiny pictographic character represents a year, a winter, and a moment of collective memory. But seeing them in a museum is different from seeing them in use. It's like watching an administrator add a new image while explaining its meaning to children who will one day maintain the count themselves. The living tradition has vanished. Although the descendants of the guards sometimes still know these stories, sometimes can explain the meaning of certain images, and can restore some background, making the count more than just a strange artifact. These winter statistics carry some profound pain. These attempts preserve time and memories in simple images. They represent a history, but is neither objective nor complete. This acknowledges from the very beginning that what is remembered is what seemed important to someone at that time, filtered through personal perception and collective agreement. A winter remembered by people for its heavy snow might also have witnessed births, love stories and conflicts. But if the snow is the most prominent, it is what has been recorded. The count did not try to catch everything. It captures sufficient information to trigger memory, allowing people to recall a more complete story when they see the image and look back. From this perspective, the records of winter might be more authentic than the traditional historical records. Traditional historical records often pretend to be comprehensive and objective, but in reality they are also selective, merely determining what is important and what is not based on different criteria. The account acknowledges their limitations and their subjectivity. In doing so, they remind us that all history is one-sided. All memories are selective. All attempts to preserve the past are bound to be incomplete. Winter itself, the physical reality of coldness and snow, as well as survival, has not changed as much as you might imagine. The temperature in the Great Plains region will still drop to -30 or 40 degrees. The snowstorm closed the highway and stranded travelers, still causing difficulties for those living there. What has changed is the infrastructure on which we depend for survival: houses with heating, grocery stores with inventory, snow removal machines and emergency services, as well as weather forecasts issued several days in advance. Clothes made of synthetic materials can keep warm more effectively than any natural fibers. Survival has become easier, more reliable, less dependent on personal knowledge, and more dependent on technology and social systems. However, these systems may fail, and when they do, the old knowledge becomes relevant again. Power outages in winter, vehicle malfunctions in remote areas, and unexpected storms. These circumstances deprive the technical buffer, revealing that winter remains dangerous, still capable of killing the unprepared, and still requires respect, caution, and knowledge. The descendants of these two traditions, those whose ancestors lived in tents and those whose ancestors built Saudi Arabia, still live on the plains and face winter every year. They carry different histories, different memories, and different cultural frameworks to understand their relationship with this landscape and the seasons. That they have all experienced cold, wind, and snow, which have erased the horizon and made the world seem small and unstable. When spring finally arrived, they all felt relieved, all were grateful for the warmth, and all understood that winter would return. No matter what human wishes or plans were, this cycle continued. The winter count displayed in the museum attests to this continuity. Winter occurs before anyone records it, and after all the records have been forgotten, the plain will continue to freeze. The wind will keep blowing. The snow will continue to fall, showing no concern for human existence and demanding accommodation from anyone who chooses to live here on the Dakota plains. Not everyone has to spend the winter in soda water with dirty floors and thin walls. Not everyone has a fixed supply of beans and cornmeal in February. They want to know if the supply can last until spring. Even on this remote frontier, there is a group of people whose winter experiences, though still very difficult, are fundamentally different from those of ordinary settlers. These people were the elites of the plains, officers stationed at border fortresses, local officials and their families, railway supervisors overseeing the expansion of railways on the grasslands, and wealthy ranchers who had obtained sufficient funds for large minor-scale operations. The merchants in the small town got rich by providing goods to the poor. Their numbers are very small and they are scattered far away. Their experiences in winter revealed how much difference wealth and status can make. The same storm killed a settler's child. For those who have better housing, more resources and access to support systems that those living in isolated homes cannot obtain, this might just be an inconvenience. Think of the Abraham Lincoln Castle built in the early 1870s near what is now Bismarck. This is one of several military facilities designed to project federal power onto the northern plains to protect railway construction and serve as a base against the indigenous resistance movement. Hundreds of soldiers lived in the fortress, along with officers and their families, wives, scouts, and civilian employees. It was a complete community maintained by the resources of the U.S. Army. These buildings are very sturdy. The officers' dormitories were made of wood and had multiple rooms. The soldiers' barracks could accommodate dozens of people, equipped with large stoves for heating, stables for cavalry and horses, a warehouse for supplies, a hospital, a bakery, and even a stage for summer concerts. When winter comes to Lincolnburg, life naturally becomes even more difficult. The temperature has dropped as severely as in any Saudi Arabia. The wind is still blowing fiercely. The snow was piled up equally deep. However, the residents of the fortress faced these situations behind thick wooden walls, which had glass windows for ceiling and ventilation. They used specially designed stoves for efficient heating, and their warehouses were filled with firewood and coal. Before heavy snow made transportation impossible, they transported them in by carriage. They have blankets issued by military supply officers, food provided by military logistics, and medical services offered by military doctors. The wives of officers, such as Libby Custer, spent the winter at the border fortress. She wrote letters and kept diaries, describing the winter as uncomfortable but manageable, and even dull. They complained of being confined indoors and lacking social activities, due to the weather not allowing travel or entertainment. The routine of the military became even more monotonous, that they did not write about worrying whether the children would go hungry, nor did they write about frostbite and losing their toes, nor did they write about lying in bed fearing that the roof would collapse. What they care about are completely different issues. How to maintain a seemingly civilized life. How to make use of time during the long winter. How to manage servants and maintain social status under the special circumstances of the border military society. In places like Fort Lincoln, the residences of officers are much more spacious than those of immigrants in Saudi Arabia. Multiple rooms allow for functional separation. A living room can receive guests, the dining room for meals, the bedroom for sleeping, and even a small room can be used as a study or office. The furniture is genuine furniture, not rough wooden boards, but items transported from the East or ordered from catalogs, such as chairs with cushions, tables with tablecloths, and beds with real mattresses and bed frames. The floor is made of wood, not dirt, and can be carpeted. Paintings can be hung on the wall and curtains can be hung on the window, in sharp contrast to the lives of ordinary settlers. When a family in Saudi Arabia is crammed into a single room, fighting the cold around a fire, an officer's family might gather in a warm living room, with children playing on the floor, adults reading or chatting, and a lamp providing a steady light without the need for such meticulous rationing. Have a regular diet and a relatively rich variety of foods. The army bought beef, flour, sugar, coffee and vegetables. Although the quality may not be the same as what you find in city restaurants, it is reliable, sufficient and predictable. Officer families can supplement their military rations by purchasing additional items, canned foods, preserved fruits, tea or chocolate and other luxury goods from postal merchants. They can also hold banquets, combining the resources of several families to prepare nearly elegant meals, at least by frontier standards. In contrast, immigrant families would measure out the last few pounds of flour, make soup with salt, pork and beans, and let their children go to bed hungry because they simply didn't have enough food. The families of military personnel do not have such despair. Their winters might be boring and cold. Even though the heating is good and they might feel isolated, they have never been as life-threatening as the winters of immigrants. The entertainment activities in the castle include some that seemed impossible to be luxuries for the people of the private plot dancing and parties, amateur drama performances, card games and breeding circles, decorated festival celebrations and special meals. Christmas at Fort Lincoln might feature a decorated tree, families exchanging gifts, a grand feast held in the officers' dining room, and music and dance lasting until the evening. Meanwhile, 3 miles away in any direction, an immigrant family will celebrate Christmas. If they really want to celebrate Christmas and if they can spare some time, they will have a slightly larger meal. Perhaps it's giving the children a small gift made from scraps of cloth or wood, or thanking them for surviving another Christmas and hoping they can make it to the next one. A connection between these fortresses and the outside world is something that a single hen can never achieve. While they were working, the telegraph lines brought news from the capital of the eastern region and other military facilities. Mail arrives regularly, of course. It may be delayed due to winter, but it can still reach. It is carried by military messengers who take routes that civilian postmen would not attempt. The officer's wife can write to her family in the East and receive a reply within a few weeks. Stay in touch with the larger world and remind herself that the fortress is temporary and she will eventually return to the civilized world. In contrast, settlers might not have had any communication with the world outside their immediate neighbors throughout the winter. Letters sent in November may not be received until April, and replies will not be received until summer. This state of isolation is complete and absolute, with no clues of any connection to distant places or people. These fortresses also have health care. Although it is primitive by modern standards, it is much better than what immigrants can obtain. Armor surgeons do not always succeed in treating frostbite, pneumonia, fever and injuries that through practical medical training, using instruments and drugs, at least have some knowledge of diseases and treatments. A child who contracted pneumonia in the fortress has the opportunity to receive care that could potentially save their life. In the warm ward, with the care of people with medical knowledge, any available medicine can be obtained. The children of settlers suffering from the same disease received home remedies and prayers, but often died. This difference in healthcare alone means that there is a significant disparity in winter mortality rates between military families and settler families. Although immigrants lost their children and spouses, they could have survived if they had received proper care, and military families, although not immune to disease and death, fared much better. Apart from military fortresses, there are other forms of elite life on the plain. In the 1876 and 1880s, railway companies pushed their lines westward through the Dakota region. These railway companies retained some stations, and individuals and senior employees lived in relatively comfortable places. Railway towns like Fargo or Grand Forks have solid buildings, hotels serving passengers and railway workers, warehouses filled with rail miners transported goods, and resources that are lacking in isolated homes. In such a town, a railway supervisor might live in a large house heated by multiple stoves. If the town has a gas plant and hires helpers to manage the household, he might even live in a stove with a gas lamp. His winter work includes continuing to manage the train schedule, supervising the maintenance of lines and equipment, and coordinating the flow of goods and passengers. But he works in a heated office and travels by heated train when necessary. Every night he returns to a comfortable home where his family prepares a hot meal for him. In sharp contrast, a settler might see a train passing by in the distance, catch a glimpse of a movement and force heading elsewhere, but be unable to obtain its resources, and cannot benefit from its existence, except for selling grains at the price determined by railway freight rates in autumn. This railway enabled some people to lead a comfortable and prosperous life, while others fell into isolation and hardship. The wealthy ranchers represent another form of elite life on the plains. These people came here with capital. They bought or occupied large tracts of land and conducted business around herds of hundreds, or even thousands of cattle. Their ranch houses are usually sturdy structures made of ground, wood rather than turf, with multiple rooms, real windows and a solid structure, which are much better at withstanding wind and cold than the cottages of self-minus cultivating farmers. They hired farm workers, cowboys living into minus-story houses, to take care of the cattle in winter and undertake the dangerous job of riding horses to inspect the cattle during storm. The rancher himself might occasionally ride out on horseback and might supervise and manage, but he is not exposed to the continuous pain of doing all the work. He received assistance, with employees taking on the most dangerous and difficult tasks. When the situation became too severe, he could return to his relatively comfortable house. The living conditions of his family, wife and children are similar to those of the middle class in the eastern United States. They have enough food and warm clothes. The children's education is either provided by hired tutors or sent to schools in distant towns. Obtain goods ordered from the catalog or purchased on the way to the railway town. Winter remains isolated and still restricts their activities, but this does not threaten their survival. They know they have enough food to sustain their lives, enough fuel to keep warm, and sufficient resources to withstand any storm. This kind of certainty, this sense of security itself, is a luxury that most settlers cannot afford. Farmers and their families might even find that winter has its own kind of comfort, allowing them to escape from the busy work of other seasons, have time to read, time to pursue their hobbies, and time to simply rest. A winter that non-self-minus cultivating farmers might offer a wealthy rancher an opportunity to relax, think and engage in a career unrelated to survival. Territorial officials, governors, judges and legislators spent the winter in relatively comfortable territorial capitals, such as Yenton or Bismarck. These constantly developing small towns offer conveniences that rural areas do not have, such as hotels with restaurants, stores selling various goods, social opportunities, and heated public buildings. District judges may hear cases in courts with large furnaces. You might stay in a hotel where there are staff members making a fire to cook. One might chat with other officials and celebrities in the evening, sipping whiskey and smoking cigars, discussing politics and business. His winter is busy with work, but very comfortable, not affected by the worst weather. His wife, if she were by his side, would be involved in the limited but real social life of the territorial capital, gatherings, church services, charity events. She will wear fashionable clothes, or at least try to be fashionable, to maintain the standards of appearance and behavior and connect her with the broader culture beyond the border. Meanwhile, immigrant women wear the same patched clothes day after day, because they are the only warm enough clothes they have. They may wash their hair once a month, because the hot water for bathing consumes too much fuel. Apart from seeing their neighbors occasionally when the weather permits, they have no social life. The merchants in the plain towns were in a middle position between the true elites and the ordinary settlers. Be successful businessman, a person who runs a grocery store or a grain lift, has a stable income, a building that provides both commercial and living spaces, and can purchase goods from others. His winter means keeping the store open when the weather permits, selling supplies to settlers who come to town, offering loans that may or may not be repaid, and gradually amassing wealth as the people he serves struggle to survive. He is wealthier than his customers, but not as isolated as military officers or wealthy farmers. He lives in the middle ground, where comfort is real but not excessive, and where security exists but not absolute. The children of these elite groups, the children of officers, the children of merchants, and the children of farmers experienced a different winter from that of the children of immigrants. They have received education, usually from well-educated teachers, rather than anyone who can be persuaded to take the job. They have toys and books, real toys ordered from the catalogue, and these books expand their world beyond what is right before their eyes and visible. They have well-fitting warm clothes, leak-proof shoes and cold-proof coats. Most importantly, they have a sense of security that immigrant children lack. They don't sleep on an empty stomach, don't worry that their parents can't provide for their daily needs, and don't carry the anxiety that pervades family life. This psychological difference, this freedom from constant fear and scarcity, shaped their entire lives, giving them confidence and optimism, which children who grow up in despair rarely cultivate. However, despite these advantages and despite the fact that wealth and status can mitigate the worst effects of winter, no one on the plain can be completely immune to danger, regardless of social class. Those who die in a snowstorm. Even a wealthy farmer riding a fine horse or an officer carrying official documents may be as prone to death as poor settlers. The children's snowstorm of 1888 took away some victims from the privileged class as well as immigrant children, who accounted for the largest number of deaths. The storm doesn't care whether you are wearing expensive clothes or riding a fine horse. If you are trapped outside when a storm comes, your chances depend on luck and knowledge rather than wealth. This vulnerability creates a sense of equality in winter, reminding people that nature has imposed restrictions on the human hierarchy. If a wealthy rancher gets lost between the barn and the house, he will freeze to death just a few yards away from his residence, just like a poor self-manistiller. If the storm stops supplies for too long, military supplies may be insufficient. A railway town might be cut off and isolated, with its connection to the outside world severed by heavy snow until the weather improves. These shared moments of vulnerability, rare yet real, have complicated the already obvious differences between the rich and the poor on the plain. Everyone understands that winter deserves respect. Anyone who makes mistakes or has bad luck will be killed by winter, no matter how much money they have or what their social status is. However, the overall pattern is still quite clear. Wealth brings about safety, comfort, security, and survival. A military officer family celebrates Christmas with Christmas wreaths, gifts, and feasts, while an immigrant family huddles in the dark Saudi Arabia, hoping that the flowers will last for another month. The gap between the two is not only reflected in resources, but also in the basic quality of life, in hope in despair, and in the difference between viewing winter as an inconvenience and seeing it as a threat to daily survival. The elites on the plain understood this gap and knew that their comfort partly depended on the labor of the poor. The wages of farm workers barely make ends meet. They live in humble stalls and take risks that ranchers don't have to bear. Soldiers join the army because they have no other choice. They endure military discipline and the hardships of the border, but receive very little pay. In contrast, officers live relatively comfortably under command from safe positions. The price at which settlers bought goods from merchants made the merchants rich, while leaving the settlers in debt forever. This economic structure is neither unique to the plains nor measured by the standards of the 19th century. This is merely the way society is organized itself. Wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few people, while the majority is struggling. But in winter, this gap becomes even more obvious and significant, because winter is the time when resources are most crucial. In winter, whether there is enough becomes a matter of life and death. Some of the elites have recognized this and feel a certain degree of responsibility or guilt. The wife of an officer might organize charity events, collect clothes or food and distribute them to struggling settler families. Businessmen may offer credit more generously than business acumen suggests, for they know that refusing credit could mean a family going hungry. Ranchers may hire additional staff in winter to provide job opportunities and accommodation when they can't find work. These charitable or kind acts have had some impact on the fringes. It helped some families that might otherwise not have been able to survive, but it did not fundamentally change the structure of inequality. The elite remain the elite and the poor remain the poor. Winter continues to treat them in different ways, a way that is related to the organization of human society and has nothing to do with an individual's merits or virtues. The churches in small towns attempt to bridge these gaps, promoting common humanity, charity and brotherhood, and emphasizing that the rich and the poor are all equal before God. Sunday worship, at least in theory, brings together people of different classes: merchants and their customers, farmers and their workers, officers and soldiers. But even in the church, differences still exist. The rich sat in the front row, dressed in better clothes, contributing more to the collection and having greater influence on the church's decisions. If the poor come, they will sit at the back. Many immigrants live too far from towns to attend gatherings regularly. Even if they do come, they will be strongly aware of the shabby appearance, worn minus out clothes, and obvious poverty. The festival celebrations most clearly reveal the differences. In the capital or military fortress of a region, Christmas means decoration, music, gifts, special meals, and a sense of abundance and generosity. Spending Christmas in an isolated homestead means doing nothing, muddling through, and trying to create a sense of celebration from scratch, but often fails. The day passes as usual, except for praying that you survived and hoping for a better future. The new year brings a similar contrast. The elite celebrated with parties and toasts, building on their solid positions and looking forward to the new year optimistically. When immigrants celebrate the new year, if they are really going to celebrate it, they will make up their minds to get through another winter, another season, and another year of hardship. If they are lucky, working tirelessly without sleep may eventually bring a little prosperity. Local newspapers are published in towns and are mainly read by the elite and the middle class. Sometimes they report on the hardships, storms, deaths and struggles along the border, but these reports have a sense of distance and are observations, rather than experiences. The story of a family being found frozen to death in a small wooden house serves as a cautionary tale for readers who will never encounter such a situation, reminding them to be grateful for their circumstances. Perhaps this is a reminder for charitable donations to help those who are less fortunate. The true experiences of that family, despair, fear and pain, were all condensed into a few paragraphs on the last few pages. Interesting but not urgent, tragic but distant. From December to January and from February to March, as winter progresses, the accumulation of strains varies among different classes. For the elite, winter becomes monotonous and dull, and they can only endure it until spring brings new vitality and opportunities. For immigrants, winter is getting more and more desperate day by day. With supply dwindling and fatigue accumulating, the question shifts from will we be comfortable? It becomes can we survive? By the end of February, self-managed cultivating farmers are often on the verge of collapse, without flour, without fuel, without energy, just waiting for the arrival of spring, lest it be too late. In contrast, the elite class still has reserve resources. Their warehouses and storerooms still store supplies. Their fuel reserves are still sufficient. There is still something on their ladder. They have enough confidence to believe that they can get through it. Spring will come before their resources are exhausted. This kind of confidence itself is a kind of wealth, a psychological resource that the poor lack. Knowing that you will survive, you can consider other things, make plans for the future, and keep hope and optimism. Not knowing if you can get through next month, let other things become unimportant and focus your attention on the present and the desperate moment. When spring finally came, the snow melted, the ground thawed, and the cold wind was no longer bone-minus chilling. The elites resumed their lives with the least disturbance. They feel uncomfortable, perhaps restricted and bored, but they haven't changed much since coming out of winter and are ready to continue their work and comfortable life. When the immigrants came out of winter, they were hurt. Months of malnutrition made their bodies weak. Months of fear and despair left their minds scarred, and the cost of survival caused their economies to collapse. Facing spring, they did not feel relieved or optimistic. Instead, they were exhausted and realized that they had to start anew, work in another season and eventually face another winter. This cycle has no definite end. Elites can view winter as something they have conquered, as proof of their superiority, demonstrating that they can thrive even under difficult conditions. They maintain civilization, image and standards in the wilderness, proving that appropriate resources and organization can overcome any challenge. That this explanation easily overturns the fact that their success depends on resources, infrastructure, supply chains, and economic systems that ordinary settlers simply cannot obtain. What makes them feel comfortable is not their superior character or virtue. It is money, status, and power. The settlers understood this, although they seldom expressed it. They saw the contrast and knew that their pain could have been avoided. They endured the suffering not because it was necessary, but because it was the way society was organized, resources were allocated and power operated. This perception gives rise to resentment, and sometimes even bitterness, making people feel that the system has been manipulated and is not in their favor. But in most cases, it only makes people feel bored and helplessly accept that things are just like this. This kind of complaint won't change anything. Their only option is to keep moving forward, keep trying, hoping that their work will eventually pay off and they will gain a little sense of security. Meanwhile, winter returns every year, and every year it's the same division. Comfortable and desperate, protected and exposed, those who view winter as an inconvenience and treat it as a battle for survival. Snow falls on everyone in the same way, but apart from that, nothing in the Dakota plains during winter is equal. The land itself does not recognize these human divisions. The wind blew through the wooden mansion with the same force. Whoever owns them, the cold seeps into them. The storm buried both the poor and the rich under the same white blanket, but the result was different. Survival rates are different. The quality of the experience varies. All of this is shaped by the human wealth and power system, which existed before winter arrived and will continue to do so. The elites will eventually leave the border. When their mission is over, when their railway project is completed, and when they become rich, they will return to the east. Settlers, if they survive, will stay, either to prove their claims or to lose them. Eventually they will see the plains change from frontiers to settlements, and then to states, becoming the basic population of the new society. The hardships they endured in the early winter will be forgotten or romanticized, turning into stories of the courage of pioneers rather than complaints about economic inequality. But for now, during the harsh winters of the 1872 and 1882, the differences were obvious and undeniable. The chasm between comfort and despair is as wide as the vast prairie, as cold as the wind blowing across it, and as enduring as the heavy snow that tests who can survive and who cannot. Every year, we have gone through many winters, experiencing the same cold, the same wind, and the same snow on the territory of Dakota. In those years, this land was still claimed to be owned, still being shaped by the people who were chosen or forced to live there. We once stood in a thatched house and felt the coldness seeping in through the 3-foot high walls. We saw children walking to school in the morning, and within minutes it turned into a fatal situation. We studied the painted animal skins that record winter with simple symbols. We also saw some warmer rooms where the wealthy and powerful were, waiting relatively comfortably for the end of the season. All these experiences, though different, share one common fact: winter, an inevitable reality for several months each year. The northern plains become a place that requires constant attention for survival, where even the slightest mistake can lead to fatal consequences, and where the line between life and death is as thin as ice on a bucket. Winter shapes everyone who has experienced it, changing them in obvious or subtle ways. Even after the snow melts and the grassland turns green again, the traces left by winters still remain. Those settlers who survived the early winter successfully proved their claims and established sustainable farms. The rest of their lives are filled with difficult memories. They have never completely forgotten the feeling of being cold all day long, hungry and unable to sleep in bed. They worry whether the roof can hold up or if this storm will eventually submerge them. Even decades later, when they live in better houses with proper heating, reliable food and enough clothes, they still remember. They clearly remember that they can't waste anything, can't throw away food, fuel, or repairable fabric. If there is nothing in their hearts, they can't relax and enjoy comfort, whispering that all of this might disappear and winter might come again, taking everything away with rage. Their children, born in a slightly better environment, heard these stories but couldn't fully understand what their parents endured, because by the time these children grow up to be able to remember, the situation has already improved. More immigrants mean more neighbors, which means less isolation. Better construction techniques and more resources mean warmer houses. A supply brought by railways is more reliable. The store has stocked up more goods. The town has been constantly developing and providing services that did not exist in the early days. Winter is still tough and dangerous, but it no longer poses a threat to survival as it did at the beginning. Children know cold, wind and snow, though they had no idea of the particular kind of despair their parents were experiencing. That heartfelt fear stems from being alone and lacking sufficient resources to confront a season that could be fatal without any warning. Grandchildren know even less. When they emerged, it was usually at the beginning of the 20th century, when the frontier period had come to an end. The plain is divided into counties and towns, with roads and railways crisscrossing and dotted with towns featuring schools, churches and newspapers. Winter is still winter, still cold, with occasional blizzards, but the infrastructure for survival has been built. You can call for help, you can get supplies, you can rely on the system rather than just your own resources and knowledge. These grandchildren heard stories about the past, about the sun and the children's snowstorms, and about the cold winter that made the cows freeze stiff even standing there. That these stories are becoming increasingly distant, more and more like a myth of a vanished world. Grandchildren live in a different reality where winter is controllable and where you have reason to believe that you will get through it without suffering great pain or loss. This transformation occurred rapidly within 2 or 3 generations. The harsh frontier winters of the 1872 and 1882 turned into nearly difficult troll winters of the 1922, and then into uncomfortable but controllable small-town winters of the 1952 and beyond. Each generation is built on the foundation of what the previous generation learned and established. Every country has inherited better infrastructure and more knowledge. Everyone has more resources and less fear to face winter. This process was not smooth. Sandstorms and depressed years also brought them suffering. It turns out that survival is never completely guaranteed, but the overall trend is to be safer, making winter something bearable rather than something that might cost you your life. Before the arrival of immigrants, the indigenous people who had lived on the plains for centuries faced their own transformation during this period. The extinction of bison herds, restrictions on reserves, and the forced abandonment of traditional ways of life. All of this occurred roughly simultaneously with the immigration experiences we have been exploring, creating a complex layer of different ethnic groups, different experiences, and different relationships with the land and the seasons. The Lakota, Dakota and Nakota all have their own knowledge of spending the winter on the plains. Knowledge has been developed over several generations, encoded in practice and stories, as well as the winter counting we studied before, that as living conditions changed, their knowledge became increasingly irrelevant because the bison disappeared, the government provided rations, and they were forced to live in settled reservations. The winter after their imprisonment was different from the previous one. The trauma of poverty, loss and cultural destruction shaped their winter. They are facing the same cold as ever, but now they come from a system designed to erase their way of life, forcing assimilation and turning them into people they have never been. A comparison of their experiences with those of immigrants reveals some important things about winter and survival. This is not merely about physical conditions, temperature, wind and snow, but about having the knowledge, resources and autonomy to effectively deal with these conditions. Both indigenous people and poor immigrants are facing serious difficulties, but their suffering was caused by greater factors, such as colonization, economic inequality and power, which determined who could obtain what resources, who could receive support and who could only fight alone. Most of the elite officers, railway supervisors and wealthy farmers from the frontier period left. When their time on the plain was over, they returned to the east or moved to the city, taking away their memories of the border winter, but leaving behind the actual experience of that kind of life. Some people describe their time on the frontier in their memoirs, usually with a tone of adventure and achievement, depicting their experiences as tests and excitement rather than terror and despair. These memoirs have become part of people's memory of the frontier period, and have influenced a broader cultural understanding of that era. But their perspective is limited and filtered by privilege, unable to fully capture the experiences of the majority of people on the plain. Their winter is real, their unease is genuine, but their description neglects the fundamental element of fear of true despair, which is a characteristic of those with fewer resources in winter. The scenery here still bears the imprint of this period of history, although you must know what to look for. In Dakota, Nebraska and Montana, you can find the remains of old homesteads, depressions where earthen houses once stood, the stone foundations of collapsed buildings, and rusty agricultural equipment gradually being restored by the grass on the prairie. These traces are subtle and easily overlooked, but they are right there, waiting for those who seek them out. Thousands upon thousands of families came to the west, living on the vast grassland and enduring the winter that tested their limits. Some of these families succeeded, proving their claims and establishing farms that their descendants are still running today. Others failed. After one or several winters, they gave up, left the plain, returned to where they had come from, or moved westward, or simply vanished from the historical records, leaving only a depression on the ground and a mark on the land office ledger to prove that they had been there. The towns that developed during the frontier period took different paths. Some cities have flourished, becoming county towns or regional centers, and have developed into small cities with all the conveniences of modern life. Others declined with the rerouting of railways or the consolidation of agriculture, becoming deserted buildings and streets, with the wind blowing unobstructed. Those monuments of unfulfilled ambitions, those that could no longer sustain their communities once the initial settlement period was over. Several of these ghost towns still show signs of struggling in winter. The building faces to avoid the north wind, thick walls used for insulation. The cellar has delved deeply into storage and protection. By the early 20th century, most of the fortresses that provided shelter and comfort for military families had been retired. Once the Indian War ended and the border was declared closed, their troops were withdrawn. Some have turned into state parks or historical sites. The buildings have been preserved or rebuilt, presenting to tourists what military life on the border looks like. Today, as you pass by Fort Lincoln, you can visit the officers' quarters and imagine the winter described earlier, the relatively comfortable life, social life, and protection against bad weather. But you might have walked through it in summer or on a mild day. Even with imagination, you can't fully understand what the winter at that time and place means. Winter calendars, those hieroglyphic calendars that record the memories of indigenous people, are now mostly preserved in museums and archives, studied by scholars and occasionally displayed to the public. Some tribes have been striving to retrieve and interpret their winter counts in order to restore oral traditions and give these images full meaning and pass on this way of recording history to the younger generation. For the tradition itself, that is, the practice of breeders adding a new image each year while explaining its significance to the community, has basically come to an end. These counts remain works of art, beautiful and mysterious, serving as a bridge to a way of thinking about time and memory, different from the mainstream cultural approach. It reminds us that there are multiple ways to understand and document human experiences. Modern life on the northern plains still involves winter and still requires residents to be prepared for cold, snow and wind. Even with all the advantages of modern technology, these can still be dangerous. After the blizzard of 1888, there were other severe winters, other storms that caused the death of people and livestock, and other signs indicating that despite our best efforts, nature has not yet been fully tamed. But the experience now is completely different. Weather forecasts provide several days warning for most storms, allowing people to prepare and reduce accidents. The transportation system, highways, snow blowers and emergency services mean that isolation is rare and temporary. Communication technology, telephones and internet broadcasting enable people to stay in touch even when they are unable to travel. Heating systems and insulated buildings, reliable electricity and gas services mean that keeping warm mainly involves paying for water and electricity bills rather than transporting fuel and taking care of fires. These changes represent true progress and a genuine improvement in human welfare and should not be ignored or romanticized. Experiencing a winter in Dakota in the 1882 was objectively more difficult, more dangerous and more likely to lead to death or suffering than experiencing the same winter in the 2022. In any simple sense, those who survive the early winter are not heroes. They are just those who have no better options. They have to do what they must do to survive. Sometimes they succeed and sometimes they fail depending on factors beyond their control. We will not pretend that their suffering is noble or a cultivation of character, but rather honestly admit what they have endured and recognize how far we have come to enable people living in one of the harshest climates on the European continent to survive the winter. Meanwhile, in the process of transitioning to an easier winter to a survival that doesn't require constant vigilance and effort, something might have been lost. Facing the scarcity of resources in winter, immigrants and indigenous people developed some knowledge and adaptability that were no longer necessary. These skills have shrunk due to obsolescence. Most people today couldn't even survive for a few days under the conditions that previous generations experienced for several months. It's not because we are weaker or less capable, but because we have never learned these skills and never cultivated that particular resilience. We exchange this knowledge for comfort and security, which might be a very good deal, but it is worth admitting that we have lost something. The stories of those winters, the stories of immigrants, the stories of indigenous people, the stories of survival and loss remain important. Even though the direct experiences they described have become history, they remind us that comfort and safety are the recent developments. For most of human history, people have been confronted with situations that modern humans cannot tolerate. Our ancestors, both physically and culturally, endured things that we could hardly imagine. They also remind us that these conditions are not inevitable or necessary and can be improved through better social organization, through different resource allocations, and through systems that prioritize human welfare over profit or expansion. When the officers were comfortably living in wooden houses, the settlers suffering in prison did not do so because pain was inevitable, but because the way society was organized concentrated resources in the hands of a few, leaving the majority struggling. These lessons are of contemporary significance, although we will not elaborate on them here. It can be said that winter on the plain not only teaches us how to survive, but also how society operates, how inequality works, and how the system determines who prospers and who barely survives. When you now lie in any comfortable space you occupy, warmed by systems you don't have to care for, nourished by food you don't have to search for, grow or carefully ration, connected by technologies that were like magic to people in the 1880s, and linked to the world beyond your surrounding environment, You might be grateful for these environments because you live in an errant place where winters are inconvenient rather than fatal. You can also think of those ancestors. They endured the winter we are exploring tonight. They endured, and sometimes they couldn't. They left their marks on this land and in our memories, telling us that humans can both endure pain and recover. The winter has come to an end. A long time has passed. The coldness that enveloped them was released a century, or even earlier. They returned to Earth and were buried in cemeteries scattered across the plains. Their names are engraved on weathered stones or completely forgotten. Most of their personal stories have been lost, but their collective experiences have been preserved in the form of fragments, documents, artifacts, and the landscapes themselves. The snow that buried them melted and melted countless times again. The wind that made them feel cold had blown away, and all was silent. The 4 seasons keep cycling without pause and without memory, but we remember to some extent. We tell their stories, we study their artifacts, we try to understand what they have gone through and what it means. We do this partly out of historical interest, partly to commemorate those who have struggled, and partly to better understand ourselves and the society we have inherited from those difficult times. Now, as you gradually fall asleep, when your consciousness releases its control, and when your heart enters a dream or darkness, you can let go of these stories. Let them settle in memory like snow, gentle and quiet, covering the landscape of your thoughts with a soft white blanket, masking the sounds and blurring the details. The winter we spent together has long passed. Their danger has become history. Their coldness cannot reach your warmth and safety. Make the image disappear. Grass house, a school building with only one room, a figure struggling in the white chaos, hieroglyphics on leather, the comfortable living room in the officer's dormitory. Let them blur and melt, like the snow in spring, just like all the thunder gods and the ice and snow that we visited tonight. The Great Plains remain there, still facing winter every year, still enduring cold, wind and snow, under the same vast sky that covers settlers, indigenous people, and all those who live and die on this vast prairie. But you weren't there. Here you are, warm and safe, able to sleep freely without worrying about the cold, hunger, or storms. Rest and dream freely. Let your consciousness go. The pace of breathing slowed down, turning into the rhythm of snowfall. Gentle and composed, she conceals everything with a soft silence. Your body relaxes, releasing the tension of the day and immersing yourself in the comfort that previous generations cherished so much. Sink, soften, let go. Winter has come to an end in the story and in your mind. Spring is just ahead, bringing warmth and new life. But that's for the future, for tomorrow when you wake up. Now only at this moment, this quiet drift, this gentle descent, enters rest. The wind whistling through the grassland turned into the white noise of a fan, soothing the heart without end. The life minus threatening cold has turned into a pleasant coolness in your room. The darkness that fell upon the thatched huts, tents and fortress buildings has turned into the darkness behind your closed eyes, peaceful and non-minus threatening. You are safe. You are warm. You are far away from those severe winters, and those who endure them. Their struggle has now become history. It's a long way off. I can't touch you. Only at night, when sleepiness slowly but firmly descends, do I tell a story in a soft voice. Let it come. Let consciousness vanish like footprints in the snow, gradually filling up until there is no trace left. Let your thoughts melt like snowflakes on the warm ground. Let everything be quiet and still soft. After winter passed, the immigrants finally found a place to rest. After years of struggle ended in one way or another, indigenous people found their own rest, or are still seeking it, still bearing losses that cannot be measured or repaired. Soldiers, officers, and wealthy farmers found rest in different places, under different circumstances and with different memories. All people, regardless of their experiences or outcomes, eventually come to the same quiet place, where the struggle and the story come to an end. You are now approaching that place, the edge between wakefulness and sleep, where the worries of the day gradually fade away, and the constant activity of the brain finally calms down. This is a minor death, sleep, a temporary abandonment of consciousness. Your body knows how to do it without your help or permission. Let it happen. Let the winter in Dakota become history. Let the cold, The chilly wind and the heavy snow only exist in memory in stories, and in the gentle drift of words that led you into rest time and again. Every winter, the grassland slumbers and rests under the snow, waiting for the arrival of spring, patient and quiet. You can sleep like that too. Be patient and calm, believing that morning will come and that warmth will return. This peaceful darkness is temporary and safe. Sleep now. The story is over. The journey through history has been completed. Winter has passed, taking away the dead and releasing control over the living. You can rest freely, let go freely, and float freely towards any dream or darkness that awaits you. Sleep. The wind is just the humming sound of a fan. Coldness is merely a comfortable coolness. Darkness is just a rest. Sleep. Everything is very quiet now. Everything is still. Everything was gentle and distant, gradually vanishing into the white silence.